The Crimean Peninsula is an important strategic point for controlling the Mediterranean Sea, as we have learned in recent years. However, some of you may not know that Crimea has been a tinderbox for much longer. For more than a century, this particular place experienced one of the most important wars in European history, a war that pitted the Russian Empire against the great European powers of the time, France and the British Empire. The Ottoman Empire also played a significant role in this war. In Palestine, history tends to repeat itself, and we continue to tell this story today in Memoirs of Fish, the Crimean War. The 15th century provided the antecedents for this conflict, when the Ottoman Empire began to decline due to religious conservatism and a lack of colonial territories. The European ideas of the Enlightenment failed to permeate the Islamic giant of the moment. Corruption was systemic in its structure, and the Ottoman army had become obsolete in comparison to the armies of Western Europe, despite Sultan Selim III's efforts. Mahmud Fun's continued efforts to reform the empire and adopt Western ideas, as Peter the Great had already done in Russia, yielded positive results. Under the guise of reform, European powers increasingly intervened in the empire's politics, sensing Ottoman weakness. To protect Christian minorities in this context, the Russian Empire was responsible for protecting the Orthodox Christian population, which was approximately 30%. The other European powers, who were also horrified by the Ottomans, urged Sultan Mahmud II to sign the Ackerman Convention in 1826, which favored Russian interests. The Sultan accepted this, but the following year, he declined to sign the Treaty of London, which granted broad autonomy to the Greek provinces. The new Russo-Turkish War ensued, leading to the Ottomans' defeat and the Russians' realization of a crucial fact. If the Ottomans resisted but remained weak, no rival power could seize control of their territories. However, the European powers were not stupid and knew exactly what the Russian Empire was doing. In the Russo-Turkish War of 1768-1774, Russia managed to impose his dominion over the Crimean Khanate, formerly an Ottoman vassal, obtaining important concessions such as free passage through the Bosphorus and Dardanelles and the right to build an Orthodox church in Constantinople. Finally, in 1783, Russia annexed Crimea and included it in the new province of Taurida. Let's say that the Russians were expanding during the 17th century. Grigor Potemkin, who was close to Catherine II, promoted the idea of Russia as the Third Rome and proposed the Greek project, which aimed to dismember the Ottoman Empire and restore the Byzantine Empire with its capital in Constantinople. To unify the Orthodox population under the Russian throne, the expansion towards the south also involved a colonization program in the new Russia, which would be the south of modern Ukraine, encouraging the settlement of Christians and promoting the departure of the Crimean Tatars. This growing Russian influence worried European powers, leading to a feeling of Russophobia in the 19th century. As we have seen, British concerns about a possible Russian threat to their trade routes to India led to geopolitical competitions in regions such as Afghanistan and Persia, known as the Great Game. As mentioned, the holy places in Palestine also entered into this game, a topic of discord between Catholics and Orthodox that Napoleon III of France would use as a pretext for future war. In 1851, the French ambassador Charles de Lavallee intensified the dispute over the holy places by asserting that ancient treaties secured Catholic control over them, a claim Russia perceived as a threat to its Orthodox interests. Napoleon III attempted to use this to drag the United Kingdom into a supportive position in a conflict with Russia. In 1853, Russia responded by sending General Alexander Menshikov to negotiate harshly with the Ottoman Empire, seeking to establish a protectorate over the Orthodox Christians in the empire, which would have effectively turned the Ottoman provinces into Russian vassals. Tensions escalated, prompting the Ottoman Sultan to dispatch Russian troops. The Ottomans looked to the French and British for assistance, but they couldn't agree on who to back: their Christian adversaries or their vulnerable Muslim adversaries from whom they could make gains. The war between the Russians and the Ottomans formally began when Russia invaded. In July 1853, the Danubian principalities of Moldavia and Balakwa were under Ottoman sovereignty, but with administrative autonomy. In October of that year, the Ottoman Empire declared war on Russia over the Russian army. Although it had more than 2 million soldiers, since it was the largest army in the world, corruption, poor logistics, and outdated equipment undermined its effectiveness. Fortunately for them, the Ottoman army also suffered from similar problems of discipline and efficiency, worsened by the linguistic identity of its recruits. After the invasions, hostilities intensified with the naval battle of Sinope in November 1853, where the Russian fleet destroyed an Ottoman fleet. This was the event that provoked the long-awaited intervention of the United Kingdom and France. Unlike previous conflicts, the British Army was ill-prepared for a large-scale conflict. The dispersion of its forces throughout the empire, as well as the reduction of its military expenditure, maintained strict discipline. The Royal Navy maintained its position as the world's best navy, but its land army, consisting of only 153,000 soldiers, was ill-prepared to confront the 2 million Russians. However, the French had more than 300,000 soldiers and superior weapons, highlighting the Minier rifled rifle with an effective range of more than 10,000 m. In addition, the French infantry, especially the Zavos, was known for its aggressiveness, and French logistics were considered the best. The forces used in Algeria's 2 decades of conflict contributed enormously to the creation of an experienced officer corps. The Alma River was the first major battle between Allied and Russian forces. The Allies arrived in Crimea with the intention of capturing Sevastopol, a strategic port on the Black Sea that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Despite occupying strong defensive positions, the Allied troops, with their superior tactics and weapons, overwhelmed the Russians. The Allied victory in Alma opened the road to Sevastopol. Another significant battle, the Balaklava, took place shortly after. The goal of this battle was for the Russians to break the British supply chain in order to block their advance towards Sevastopol. Despite this battle being recognized as a prime example of military incompetence, it was the British Light Brigade's responsibility to carry out a suicide attack, resulting in the loss of over half of their troops due to a communication error. Even though the Allies ultimately emerged victorious in the Battle of Inkerman, which was a challenging and costly infantry battle for both sides, the press reported a significant loss of troops. Those who remained in the area, fearing the prospect of spending a winter in the frigid hell that was the Crimean War's siege of Sevastopol, were deeply troubled. The adverse weather conditions, exaggerated by a violent storm in November, greatly worsened the situation. The Sidore's inclement weather transformed the terrain into impassable mud, complicating the supply of resources to the troops. Large numbers of exhausted and poorly fed horses died, affecting logistics, particularly for the British, whose capacity to handle these adversities was inferior to that of the French. And finally, logistical problems continued to plague both sides. However, the Russians, lacking control over the sea and with compromised land supply routes, found it difficult to launch an offensive as a response to all the stormy battles that occurred during this war. The United Kingdom intensified meteorological observation, while France, taking advantage of the telegraph and new measuring instruments, began to issue weather reports and adverse weather warnings. This advance was critical to the development of the first isobaric maps and marked the beginning of modern meteorology as an essential science in both civil and military planning. Let's say that the Crimean War marks the beginning of meteorological studies. The military and political situation became more complex after the death of Tsar Nicholas the Boyan and the ascension of Alexander Permern, who committed himself not to accept a Russian defeat in the conflict. With the arrival of spring, things changed for the Allies, who intensified efforts to take Sevastopol. Finally, the arrival of reinforcements and the exhaustion of the defenders allowed the French to take the bastion of Malakoff, which forced the Russians to evacuate Sevastopol. The fighting continued for a few more months until Russia agreed to sign the Treaty of Paris on March 30th, 1856. After the Russian Empire's capitulation, the Crimean War would come to an end. It should be noted that despite one can argue that the Crimean War had more positive than negative long-term impacts on the actors involved, despite the horror of the war, the large number of casualties, and the suffering caused by all the battles. In this manner, the belligerents found support. The Ottoman Empire's power, which did not crumble or become a Russian vassal, but continued to be precarious, also received new ideas and technology from Europe. France, having suffered a setback after the wars, re-emerged as a power. The United Kingdom's Napoleonic Wars, which had made clear their military inefficiency, led to a substantial improvement in its army compared to the Russian Empire, which lost territories. The defeat discredited the army and demonstrated the country's weaknesses and backwardness in relation to Western European powers. In this way, Alexander II carried out the abolition of slavery in 1861. Ironically, the war primarily impacted Austria, a country that refrained from intervening. The issue is that the two sides are upset because Austria did not get involved, isolated it, and left it, alone in her future war against Prussia. That's it for today's video. If you enjoyed it, you already know that you can like and subscribe, and we won't see you in future videos. Until we meet again, have a great day.